Okay, so welcome to those who are watching us via live stream on Facebook, and we have people who are here in the Zoom with us who will hopefully be able to ask questions in just a little bit. My name is Rabbi Rachel Greengrass. I'm very excited to invite you into our Social Justice Speaker Series. Our Social Justice Speaker Series is one of the passion projects that we have here at Beth, where we talk about issues that are pressing in our community, ways that the world is broken, and what the Jewish response can be to that. And we are so incredibly excited because this evening is one where I get to talk to one of my heroes, somebody that I look up to, who has helped to mentor me and is amazingly gracious at holding other people up, which is Rabbi Jonah Posner. So before I invite him on, I just want to invite anybody who's here on our Zoom to please mute yourself and please turn off your video. Caesar, I love seeing your face, but thank you. So Rabbi Posner is the head of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism. The Religious Action Center is the political arm of the Reform movement. He'll teach us a little bit more about that. And he is also the vice president of the union. He is an ordained rabbi. He served a couple of congregations, both with the same name, and then decided to dedicate his rabbinate to social justice. He has a very amazing resume, lots of accolades, books, articles. He's on the board of the NAACP, and I would list them all, but I want to make sure that we have a lot of time to talk to him. So it's my pleasure to welcome to our Social Justice Speaker Series, Rabbi Jonah Posner.
Hello, Rabbi Greengrass.
Hi, Rabbi Posner.
How are you?
I'm doing really well. It's so good to see you.
Good to see you.
I was joking with Rabbi Posner that I got to see him twice yesterday, once on Rabbi Barris's show, and then he led a webinar where it was sold out. There was actually a max of 1,000 devices, and it was maxed out last night.
We crashed Zoom. We crashed the internet, actually.
That's great. So it's not just Wreck-It Ralph, but Jonah Posner can also break the internet. So I'm so happy to have you here and really excited to introduce our community to the work that you do and to talk about how we can do work together during this time. So I'd love to hear a little bit. Some of us are very much know and love the RAC and have been doing work with the RAC for a long time, but some people have never heard of the RAC. So will you kind of explain what this arm of the movement does?
I sure will, yeah. Can I tell the origin story? Because I think it's such a powerful story about...
I love the origin story.
Fantastic. Because, it's something that was a gift given to you and to me and to all of our Reformed Jewish movement, even before you or I not only were rabbis, but before we were born, frankly. So I think it's just important to acknowledge the history. There was a wonderful philanthropist in the Reformed Jewish movement named Kivi Kaplan. And Kaplan was kind of classic of the American Jewish story. Family of immigrants, came to this country with nothing from Eastern Europe, worked his way up, became a very successful businessman. And of course, like so many other philanthropists, he paid it forward and was very generous. But the defining experience of his life that became the inspiration of his philanthropy was when he was newly married to his wife, Emily Kaplan. The two of them had been living in Boston, and they traveled, deep breath, to my Beth family to Florida for their honeymoon. And they saw the sign that was ubiquitous back then: no Jews, no dogs, in many places that they tried to go. And they were very distraught. They'd never experienced anti-Semitism like this. And their black taxi driver, they turned to and said, is this common down here? And the black taxi driver said, they don't even bother with us, which was, of course, the awakening that Kaplan realized that if you threaten one minority community and oppress one minority community, you're oppressing and threatening all minority communities. And Jews in this country are blessed because of our whiteness and privileged, but anti-Semitism, racism, bigotry shows up in all forms. So Kivy became very active in the NAACP. He was actually, I don't know if people know the history, in its origin, the NAACP was a coalition of mostly white Jews and black Christians working together to beat back racism. He became the last white Jewish president of the NAACP. And when he stepped down, he was determined it would become a black-led organization since it was a black organization. But one of the things that he did as a member of the board of trustees of the Reformed Jewish Movement, what was called the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, now the URJ, Union for Reform Judaism, which I'm privileged to serve as vice president. He bought a magnificent embassy building on DuPont Circle, Massachusetts Avenue Northwest in DC, just a stone's throw from the White House and Congress, and gave it to us, the Reformed Jewish Movement. But the caveat of that gift was that we would commit to being a hub of civil rights activity. So when Dr. King would come to Washington, he would use our offices as his home base, because of course, the civil rights movement was a movement. It wasn't an organization. It was a collection of organizations, and they didn't have offices. So King used to sit in our conference room and have meetings and do his work. And we hosted the Leadership Conference for Civil Rights, which is why the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were drafted in part in our conference room, which we're very proud of. And our founder, Rabbi Dick Hirsch, was very close to King. And he was succeeded by my predecessor, Rabbi David Saperstein, who may be known to some of your folks. He's spoken at Beth and he's a good friend to the community that you lead, Rachel. He was for 40 years the director of the Religious Action Center, and he built it up from just one rabbi and an administrative assistant to be 30 professionals who, by the time I took over 5 years ago, are now dispersed throughout North America. We have staff all over the country. We work on a range of social justice issues, not just limited to the civil rights agenda. We have state projects, including one in Florida, which we will talk about. And we are kind of the hub of Jewish social justice activity, not only in Washington, where we advocate and lobby on behalf of the Reformed Jewish Movement in Capitol Hill and in the White House, but we also train our congregations to work together with each other and across lines of difference and affect change on a state and local level as well. So that is the RAC.
That's beautiful. Thank you. That story it's so moving and so powerful, where here is somebody who saw injustice and said, I'm going to do something about it. So as you mentioned, Rabbi Saperstein spoke at Beth before. For many of us, he is just an incredible icon of social justice work. When you took over his position at the Religious Action Center, it was a very different political move.
Yes.
And the structure very much shifted. So I'd love to hear a little bit about that shifting and what your goals are for the Religious Action Center.
Yeah, and I just want to give a shout out to Rabbi Rachel Greengrass, because you've been very much one of the key leaders to help us in that transformation and the transition, really modeling the leadership both on a local level in Miami, on a state level in Florida, and with us in Washington. So, I'm gonna take some of I'll tell the story, but you're very much part of it. You and a network of other rabbis who, by the way, just to pitch, are all published in a book that I know this group has read, because I know a part of your social justice group was a reading group that read this book, but Rachel Greengrass is published. And I look back to see the title of the essay that she wrote, which is a really powerful essay about climate change, but she called it Planet in Peril. And I think it was powerful when she said it 18 months ago. And now we know with this COVID crisis, which is like a warm-up act to the climate crisis, this is what a disaster looks like. And so, Rabbi Greengrass, we appreciate your prophetic voice calling us to account. And we should talk about the COVID crisis in a minute. But before we do that, you asked about the shift in the RAC. I mean, I think the thing to know about the Religious Action Center, when I took over, we did a lot of interviews of stakeholders and asked them kind of what feedback we should think about. You know, it's the first time there was a new leader in 40 years. And one very poignant observation was a rabbi said about the RAC, I love the RAC. It's awesome. I just wish it weren't a spectator sport. And I realized with that comment what my mission would be. It would be to take the incredible work that David Saperstein did in 40 years, being a powerful presence in Washington on behalf of the Reform movement, and really have the 2 million people who call themselves Reform Jews be part of that. So it wasn't going to just be about my prophetic voice or Rabbi Greengrass's prophetic voice. It would be about 2 million souls getting organized in their congregations at a local level, working together at a state level. So that's why we launched a series of community organizing initiatives. And we really started training our congregations at a very local level, like at Beth, where you are very much part of interfaith multiracial coalitions in Miami to help make Miami a more just city, in part because of some of the training and the support we offered. And we launched over the last few years 8 state projects, including RAC Florida, which are these networks of Reform congregations coming together to be able to affect change on a state level. I could not be more proud of Florida because you all came together, you helped shut down Homestead, which was this heinous detention center where kids who were migrants and refugees were being housed and caged in essence. You came together around a number of gun violence issues, particularly with March for Our Lives and after the Parkland shooting. And your signature victory, which many people on this call worked on, was question 4, the ballot amendment that when passed meant that 1.4 million formerly incarcerated people who were felons were allowed to vote again. Now, I know we should talk a little bit later. There's still an ongoing battle going on in Florida. Many of you are working on it, but that just shows you the power of what your community can do. So when you asked about the shifts that I made, I couldn't be more proud of the fact that from California to Florida to New York to Texas, Ohio, Illinois, and everywhere in between, Reformed Jewish synagogues are the engine of social change on a state and local level, in addition to advocating with us in Florida. In Washington, sorry.
Hey, we can advocate here in Florida too. Yeah, so actually my background is
Love it.
Is one of our protests in
that was Homestead, right? And we were so psyched when we saw that picture because you carried the RAC banner. Actually, if you tilt a little bit this way, people can see the language. So it's the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, and the Chai is our logo because we are really about bringing life into democracy and into American society.
So I know a little bit of your background, and I think part of your background set you up for this success that you've had so far as a leader in the Religious Action Center. And so you shared with Rabbi Barris on his show, and everybody, if you didn't watch it, go back and watch it. It's a beautiful interview. You shared with Rabbi Barris about how you became a rabbi, how important the synagogue was to your family, and how you were surrounded with love and support when you experienced loss. But taking the call to become a rabbi is a big leap and a big dedication, where you're dedicating yourself to serve the Jewish community. But you've taken another one. You heard another call, which was to dedicate your rabbinate to social justice. So I'd love to hear a little bit about that transition and about why social justice is your call.
Thank you for asking. And I hope you'll share some of your call too, because you're a great social justice rabbi, Rabbi Greengrass. I once had this profound experience with a Lutheran minister from Waco, Texas, named Reverend John Heinemeyer. And Reverend Heinemeyer had served, he's a 6'4" white Lutheran from Waco. So you can kind of picture the type. But he had served in his entire ministry Black and brown churches in places like the South Bronx in New York and Roxbury, Massachusetts, which is Roxbury, for people that don't know Massachusetts, was the Jewish community of Boston until white flight, and then became a Black community and an immigrant community. And I asked him about why. I was very intrigued. I had grown up in New York City. I went to a public school in the Bronx. So I kind of, I knew and understood like what it meant to serve a very low income, all Black and brown church in the South Bronx, one of the most devastated neighborhoods in the world. And I asked him, why he had done that. And he talked about growing up in his church in Waco and witnessing the inequalities of Jim Crow and the oppression of Black folk. And his way to respond to his call from his Christian call was to serve Jesus among the Black and brown who had been oppressed. And I was so taken with that. And he pushed me and said, Rabbi, why are you so committed to justice? I had met him through an interfaith organization called the Greater Boston Interfaith Organization, which is a community organization fighting for public education, affordable housing, and healthcare. And I said, well, Reverend Heinemeier, I'm Jewish and Jews care about justice. And he pushed me and said, well, why, Rabbi, why do you care about justice? And I said, well, like you said, I'm a rabbi. Rabbis are for justice. He said, no. Why are you for justice, Rabbi Jonah Posner? And I heard myself say for the first time in my life what it was like to grow up very active in my synagogue, loving the Jewish social justice message of my rabbis, but having lost my father at a young age and having a mother who became a single working mother who was economically vulnerable, and transitioning to the public schools. I went to a great public school in the Bronx called the Bronx High School of Science. But every day I got on the subway in 1983 and 1984, and I rode that subway train through the South Bronx, the very neighborhood that he had pastored. And I felt myself start to weep with Reverend Heinemeier. As I said, 4 years of witnessing the abject poverty of the South Bronx, the suffering, the devastation, the misery, and the gap between my Jewish values and the reality of the South Bronx is this unprocessed work I have to do. And he took me under his wing. He mentored me. He brought me to a lot of meetings and trainings and taught me what churches and synagogues could actually do to have an impact. And Rabbi Greengrass, I'll just end the story with one coda. After we got to know each other a little bit, he came to me and he said, Jonah, you don't have enough imagination about what's possible. I want you to take a trip with me to the South Bronx. And I could feel my heart rate racing. I was like, it was a very hard time in my life. I was like, Reverend Heinemeier, I don't need to go back. He goes, no, you need to see what's possible. And he said, and I want to challenge you to bring the most powerful rabbis in Boston, the head of your JCRC, the head of your Jewish Federation, and I want you to bring your two biggest donors to the synagogue, because I was a congregational rabbi at the time. Now imagine, Rachel, bringing two of your biggest machers at Beth, bringing Jeremy, bringing the head of your federation, bringing the head of your JCRC. Well, we flew from Boston to New York. We got into a van. The van let us out in the middle of this neighborhood that I had remembered as being burnt out, shelled, like a bomb had dropped, with fires burning and prostitutes and street gangs. And what I saw took my breath away, like blocks and blocks of freshly painted 2-family owner-occupied homes with gardens planted and kids playing safely in the streets and folks sitting on stoops and stores that had opened. It was a neighborhood transformed. And it wasn't like just Habitat for Humanity where you get one house. It was a transformation of a neighborhood. And I grabbed him by his big black coat with his white collar. And I said, Reverend Heinemeier, how did you do this? And he said to me, I didn't do this. We did this. The people of the South Bronx, we organized through our churches. We came together. We put pressure on the mayor of the city of New York to give us this land. We worked with Wall Street to provide favorable mortgages. We got our people into literacy, financial literacy training, and we transformed the neighborhood. And I said, Reverend Heinemeier, you are the kind of rabbi I need to be.
I'm crying. Beautiful, like such a powerful, powerful story. And I know that you went on to work in coalition to pass universal health care, working across so many aisles, whether it's, language, race, religion, politics, to get this passed with Governor Romney at the time. That was, I know that it was the start of your own first state project, your first just congregation. Can you talk a little bit about what some of the wins have been for other states?
Sure. Yeah, and by the way, the essential learning um, that I learned back then 20 years ago that you all taught and learned 2 years ago, I learned the same Torah from Desmond Mead, who was the incredible leader of the campaign in Florida to restore voting rights. And for him, this work had to be sacred and nonpartisan. Um, he brought together unlikely suspects. You know, he brought together people like the Koch brothers, who were libertarian and don't like the costs of incarceration. They don't like big government. And if you think about it, the single biggest government project in domestic US is incarceration. More of our dollars are wasted caging people that could be better spent on rehabilitating and educating people. So there were fiscal conservatives in the coalition. There were libertarians in the coalition. There were white collar criminals who vote Republican typically, but who wanted their voting rights back, alongside with communities of color and more liberal progressive groups. So Desmond, really reminded us that, and he's worked hard to keep the coalition together. What I learned in Massachusetts really was around the role that the faith community can play because we are nonpartisan, and what brings us together is enduring Jewish values. So my lead partner was Reverend Herman Hamilton, who is an evangelical African-American kind of speaking in tongues type pastor. And we were working together in healthcare. And one day when I showed up for a protest advocating for equal marriage for LGBTQ folk, I saw him on the other side of the protest. He was defending marriage. And our organizer of Greater Boston Interfaith Organization panicked and said, we can't talk about this. Like, we work on what we work on, we agree on what we agree, but we don't talk about what we disagree. And I said, and Reverend Hamilton and I both said, no, we need to talk about this. Because if we're about enduring values and relationships and community, we're not just a coalition. And so we arranged a series of house meetings for members of our synagogues in our church, our synagogue and his church, to talk to each other about why marriage mattered. And this is kind of a complicated story, but I want to share with you, we had gay couples in our congregation that shared what was at stake for them, the way they couldn't adopt together, they couldn't get healthcare proxies, they couldn't have wills. And then we heard from some people in the Black churches who were saying things like, because of mass incarceration and how many Black men get removed from society, there's a real movement by some to have polygamy and have multiple marriages. And they were worried that if you change the definition of marriage, that might open the door to polygamy. So we were able to get past that and really help people understand that polygamy is not the same thing as marriage equality, but that was a process, and it took trust building and it took relationship. So I think what I learned in Massachusetts was not just that you can get healthcare done if you bring together Catholics and Jews and Christians, and Muslims and Black, white, brown, and work together with Democrats and Republicans and find common ground with healthcare providers and insurers. That is true, but it's sustainable when the relationships and the community you build transcends an issue or a campaign. So my hope and my prayer for the folks at Beth and for RAC Florida, the nascent Florida organizing project, is that it will be more than just a series of political wins. It'll more be about building up this network of powerful relationships with each other, but also with your partners, with your allies, with the Black churches or the Latino Catholic parishes or the immigrant justice groups, and. Does that make sense?
It makes so much sense. And I think it's what a powerful message for us right now, especially, our country feels so incredibly polarized. There was this kind of beautiful moment right when quarantine first started where I felt like we were all in it together, but now it seems once again that, Team Blue versus Team Red is back in full effect. So I love this message because I think so often we feel like we can't, if you don't agree with me on everything, that I'm not going to have a conversation with you. And we agree on so much, even with people who are so, politically polarized from where we may define ourselves. We all want to, have wonderful lives. We want our kids to have a good future. We want opportunity. And I think it's beautiful that both you and the minister were able to say, no, our relationship is too valuable. Like, if somebody's important to you, talk about the hard stuff as well.
I appreciate that. I'm really curious, Rabbi Greengrass, how you are experiencing, Florida obviously is one of the most polarized states in the country. And it gets exacerbated because it's a swing state and elections are always so close. The volume gets raised up even higher. I'm curious, how has COVID either made it harder and worse and more polarized? And how has it brought people together? And how has it impacted on the work you're trying to do?
Well, I think we get a little bit of, the demonization of those who are different from us, right? There's, and Brene Brown talks about it in her book Into the Wilderness, and she says, you might be demonizing this person who's of a different political party than you, but then you find out that they're just your next door neighbor, the one who like lets you borrow the lawn shears. So I think that there's a lot of that, of neighbors coming together, smiling, being out on the streets, and kind of more of an understanding that there are things that are so much more important than just rooting for the home team. That being said, I do, of course, I see this being used politically, and it worries me, because right now we really need people who are thinking of the best interests of the community, and not people who are thinking about winning.
Amen. I will say one thing that has been remarkable. Whatever your political affiliation, the crisis, I think, is a reminder to people what's at stake and why competent, evidence-based leadership on the local level, on the state level, on the federal level, as everybody's looking for not just this president of the White House and Congress to steward, this massive stimulus package and relief package, but also to local mayors and governors who are like really having to lead, that democracy really does matter, and that whoever you vote for, it is really critical that people take on agency and ownership over their democracy. And, like you referenced last night, the call we had last night, the fact that we had more than 1,000 people, there were 3,500 watching on live, 1,000 people crashed the Zoom. And when people ask me like, well, why do you think the level of engagement is so high? I said, because in COVID, we feel like somebody has stolen our power, right? We don't, there's so many decisions we don't get to make, where it's safe to go, who we can be with. Our kids can't go to school. Some of us can't go to work. Some of us have businesses that we've spent lives building that are under duress. But this campaign gives us agency. It gives us our power back, because it's something we can do. And it gets us not only with the power to affect change, it's getting people in relationship, because that's by nature what it is. It's getting people talking to each other about the election, what's at stake, and making sure they know their voting rights, making sure they know how to vote, et cetera. So that's for me been very, very inspiring.
Oh, so I have two very different questions that are stemming from this. So I'll start with the COVID question, and then I'll go to the elections question.
Sure.
So yesterday, when you were speaking with Rabbi Barris, you talked about, how blessed you feel for you, your wife, your 4 daughters, that you are in, that while, of course, this is hard for everybody, you're feeling your privilege in this moment, which I very much resonated with me. So to go back to what you said, one of the gifts of being somebody who does social justice work is that when you see brokenness, you feel like, I'm going to dive into that. There's something I can do. Even if that something is just bearing the story of the person who is feeling oppressed. I think that's something that has also been taken away from so many of us during this crisis, that a lot of the way that we have done social action and the way that we do social justice is very hands-on. So what are some ways that we can engage while in this weird time?
Yeah, I really appreciate the question. And I've lost sleep myself, wondering, should I be doing more? There are people who are, as usual, like, forget about the healthcare workers, like they're the real heroes. and it's their job, and first responders, and God bless them, and God bless all of the medical professionals and healthcare workers, and frankly, the delivery people and the folks who showed up. We had a radon issue, and workers had to come into our house and go fix the radon thing. Easy for us to social distance, but they're in our home, so they don't know what air they're breathing. So there's that. But there's also like the people who are volunteering, who are saying, I have homebound elders in my community. I want to make sure they have food delivered. I have neighbors that I want to make sure are taken care of. There was a person in our network who is severely disabled, whose landlord was doing work on their building, and he needed to be out for like 18 hours one day and had nowhere to be. So we scrambled to make sure this person had a place to physically be. So there's a million stories like that. And I think we're all asking ourselves, should we be doing more? Should we be at the food pantry now, even with the threat and the need to social distance, but because there's not enough food, there's not enough volunteers. I mean, one of the problems all of these communities are having is there's not enough volunteers because everybody's staying at home. So there's that whole body of work. And I have no judgment. People have to gauge their own risk. People have to figure out what makes sense. I do believe that in the medium term, there's going to be something remarkable when all of these young people who can't do in-person school, and a lot want to take gap years or time off because they want to wait to go to school, are going to volunteer. And as soon as there's real testing and there's an ability to know like the antibodies and the testing, then I think you're going to see a lot of young people who are out there on the front lines, even if it's contact tracing or whatever the work is they're doing. So I think for the folks at Beth Am, I think it's thinking about like, what are the ways in which each of us can actually have an impact, even measuring the need to not take risks and to not put ourselves in danger or put our neighbors in danger. And I'm sure there's lots of discussion about Beth Am, how to make sure all of the frail elders are taken care of, people who are in nursing homes, et cetera. But I also want to say, don't underestimate the importance of advocacy right now online, because the members of your state legislature have never been more available to you, actually. You don't have to go to Tallahassee right now. They're not there anyway. And there's not a lot they can do other than constituent services. So if you're concerned about people who are incarcerated who might get COVID, if you're concerned about people in detention who might get COVID, if you're concerned about homeless people, we've seen wins in our projects across the country where teams have mobilized, put pressure on state legislators through Zoom calls and virtual actions where you gather on Zoom, get the member of the legislature or their representatives on the Zoom, and push them on things like getting homeless people into hotels, which by the way are all empty anyway. So the idea that we have empty hotels and homeless people on the streets who are going to not just get sick, they're going to perpetuate the disease. So I would really urge folks to think about what are the advocacy, quick and dirty campaigns we can be part of even right now.
I love that. Yeah, it's very exciting. And now to go to the civic engagement campaign. You talked about how important the election is right now and how we're really seeing if our leaders are, leaders. And I'd love to hear just a little bit about, the goals of the civic engagement campaign, what the RAC is hoping to do.
Totally. And again, we have so much strength going into 2020 because of what you all did in 2018. I mean, just using Florida, and then I'll blow it up across the system. Thousands of Reformed Jews door knocked, collected signatures on Shabbat, hosted Desmond Mead to tell the story of the campaign. I like to joke that the Mahjong ladies of Boca Raton helped win Question 4. I mean, from Miami to Boca and up, to Tallahassee and all across the state, that's just a picture of what is possible. And that was during the midterms. So just the origin story, just to go back, remember the signature achievement of the RAC was the drafting of the Voting Rights Act. So this goes way back for us. It's deeply personal. So I want to put this in context for people. Remember that Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner, 2 white Jewish kids and a Black Christian kid, were murdered in Mississippi during Mississippi summer when they went down to register voters and protect the vote. So it's not just the RAC, because of the role we played in civil rights history. It's the way that white Jews have always shown up in this space. And by the way, I say white Jews now because we're a much more multiracial Jewish community. We're Black Jews, brown Jews, Asian Jews, Jews of all hues. And so we are part of a civil rights movement partly because we are ethnically diverse. It isn't just like white Jews helping others. But be that as it may, people may remember that in 2012, the Supreme Court ruled in a very problematic court ruling, Shelby v. Holder, which eviscerated the Voting Rights Act, which again is our act. It had been reauthorized by Presidents Bush and Reagan, in addition to like Carter and Clinton. So the Voting Rights Act had always been bipartisan. When it was passed in 1965, it was passed by overwhelming bipartisan majorities. So suddenly the Supreme Court ruled that pre-clearance, provision 4 of the Voting Rights Act, was not constitutional, which was ludicrous. And the pre-clearance basically called for, in a state like Florida, where there was a historic pattern of voter suppression, any changes to the voting systems would have to get pre-cleared by the Department of Justice. Chief Justice Roberts, in his ruling in Shelby v. Holder, in essence, his logic was, that was then, this is now, things are better now. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg, in one of the great dissents that will go down in American history, in a scathing critique of that logic, said, that is like saying, when standing in a rainstorm under an umbrella, I don't need an umbrella anymore because I'm not getting wet. And sure enough, what happened, state after state after state started passing voter suppression laws, voter ID laws. They started closing polling places. You saw huge lines of people because, you know, if you shut down all the polling places in inner city communities, communities that tend to vote one direction, communities of color, the rest is history. So in 2016, Reverend William Barber, who is the head of the Poor People's Campaign, one of the most prominent African-American pastors in America, and is on the board of the NAACP, of which I also sit on the board, called us and said, he's a pastor in North Carolina. North Carolina was the epicenter of voter suppression. After Shelby v. Holder was ruled and the Voting Rights Act was eviscerated, the legislature in North Carolina rolled back voting rights in a way that was what an appellate court called racism with surgical precision. I'm just going to say that again, racist with surgical precision. They went in and they gerrymandered and so Barber called on us and said, I need my Jewish family to come down to North Carolina and partner with me to do civic engagement work in 2016. We learned a tremendous amount. We learned, it was not hard to get our people to mobilize. They love civic engagement. It's nonpartisan, it's 501c3 friendly, and it's about voting rights, which is core to all of us as Reformed Jews. And number two, we could have an impact. By working with and through the NAACP and the Black churches, we were able to partner together to reach communities that are underrepresented at the polls. So in 2018, we decided to take it to scale. And we had a movement-wide effort. We set as our goal 100,000 voters. We figured through the ballot initiatives, like in Florida, we had a ballot initiative in California, one in Washington State on gun violence, LGBTQ equality in Massachusetts, and through voter registration drives, through student-to-student voter engagement, largely driven by the Parkland teens and what was happening with gun violence. We wound up with 158,000 documented voter engagements. That's just what we could count. And I want to just make sure people know, oftentimes when one of our leaders would actually engage a group of voters, they didn't take the time to go back on their computer and log it in. So the 158,000 voter engagements was just that which was documented. We set as our goal for this campaign in 2020, 250,000 voter engagements, which will mean probably something like 1 million because of all the people who will do the work and not report back. It'll happen in 3 ways. It'll happen, number one, in congregations like Beth committing to 100% voting, making sure, regardless of who people are going to vote for, that every member of Beth votes. That from the youngest of the young, the people who are going to turn 18 in the next 3-4 months, to your most seniors who are maybe homebound and are going to need help, making sure everyone gets to the polls, and then partnering with neighboring institutions to make sure that they get to 100% voting, particularly targeting, that Black church that you've historically done the MLK Shabbat exchange, or the Latino Catholic parish where you do the shelter together, but making sure that they have 100% voting and working with them to get there. And then third and finally, making sure that underrepresented communities across North America, across the United States, wind up getting to the polls. And that we're doing through a new technological platform that we couldn't be more proud of. We are partnering with an organization that basically developed the technology where you can text, call, and write postcards to people targeted because they're in communities that are typically underrepresented, get in relationship with them between now and the election, engage them around the things that they're concerned about, and then make sure that they know how to vote, make sure that their vote gets counted, they know where their polling places and all that kind of stuff. The last piece too is just the students. We're working with NIFTY and our Hillels to make sure that we get to 100% voting of our young people. In 2018, we saw the highest uptick of student voting, first-time voters in American history at a midterm election, and that was the midterms. So for this presidential election, we're quite confident that we're going to see a ton of students voting.
I hope so.
And Rabbi Greengrass, you were in a meeting this morning, or maybe you weren't at the meeting, but I know Mark Bookbinder was in a meeting this morning. The Florida leadership team met just today to start crafting what your strategy is going to be to lean into the RAC Civic Engagement Campaign 2020. So hooray for Florida yet again.
Yeah, so we're doing a lot of research meetings right now to see who our coalition partners will be, what their strategies are to engage voters in Florida, and also to protect people, because we don't know what November is going to look like, if we'll be able to go to the polls or not, and just want to make sure we're thinking about how we can protect this precious right. So there are a lot of people who are here with us, and I know that they will have some questions. So if you will go ahead, if you have a question, if you just will write your name in the chat so I can call on you, I would be very happy to call on you if you have any questions for Rabbi Posner.
Just don't make no hard ones. Rabbi Greengrass has to answer all the hard ones.
You're so funny. I will answer one while I'm waiting for people to figure out where the chat is. If you have, it's either, if you're on an iPad or an iPhone, there's 3 dots that say more. The chat is there. If you're on a computer, it should be at the bottom. So you actually asked about my origin story. So I have a few versions that I tell, but my favorite is just saying that my dad's parents met in a DP camp, survivors of the Holocaust, and my mom's parents met on a picket line. So I feel like if how can you not be called to justice when that's,
Did you grow up hearing the stories? Like, was that something that was part of the narrative of your household?
So yes, I heard lots of stories from my parents and what they did. What's interesting is that my grandparents were busy parents for my parents, so they didn't have the opportunity to really share their stories with my parents, and I got to hear a lot more of them, I think, than my parents did. So Judy Cowan, if you don't mind, there you go. There's your beautiful face.
So, Rabbi Posner, hi, how are you?
Great. How are you doing?
Hi, good, thank you. So my concern is, as Rabbi Greengrass just said, that we don't know what November is going to look like as far as voting. And I think a lot of people are planning on perhaps voting by mail. And we just heard Washington, President Trump specifically, tweeting about what's happening in the state of Michigan with their voting by mail. And I'm concerned with people who want to vote by mail and what might be happening with their votes, if that is going to be an issue.
Yeah, you know the old phrase, methinks thou doth protest too much. So anybody who's that concerned about mail-in voting obviously has something to worry about. By the way, just sitting here in my own study in Bethesda, Maryland, I received my mail-in ballot. And Maryland is one of many, many states, some led by Republican governors, some led by Democratic governors, some Republican secretaries of state, some Democratic. In fact, I think the Democratic Secretary of State of Michigan, when she responded to the tweet, said, "I join my colleagues," and listed the Republican secretaries of state. Look, it's a fight, and everything in this last 4 years has been a fight just being honest. I want to remind everybody a couple things. Tweet is not policy. Tweet is tweet. So you have to acknowledge it and, appreciate it. We have spent the last 3.5 years at the RAC focusing on the actual policies that come out of the White House. And we call balls and strikes. When it's a policy that flies in the face of our values and our policy, we resist it with every fiber of our being. So we're working with our civil rights allies to stay focused on making sure that mail-in balloting is maximized and optimized in as many states as possible and as much as possible. We have allies like the NAACP Legal Defense Fund that does the litigation strategy. So they'll make sure that in the courts, the right to vote by mail and the other ways of absentee balloting getting protected. And we'll do the grassroots mobilizing, both to put pressure on governors and legislatures to provide those services and then to educate people. Because a lot of it, frankly, the grunt work of this is the organizing. It's the number of calls you can make, Judy, to people. We can get you phone rolls to say, did you get your mail-in ballot? No? Okay, here's who you call, or here's how you go online. And just make sure that people have. So I'm actually less worried about actual mail-in balloting being available. I think it will be widely available to most people. It's more a question of the confusion that gets created. And a lot of the Twitter storm is about confusing people. So we're going to have to cut through the confusion and help people make sense of like, what are their rights and what's the actual process to get it done. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome.
To stay on that topic just a little bit, I know we had one of these research meetings with Desmond Mead, who is the head of the Florida Rights Restoration Campaign. And he said that one of his problems is in the African-American community, there's a lot of mistrust of government. And then when they hear stories about, tens of thousands of absentee ballots not being counted or things not being counted because your signature doesn't look right. And I will tell you, if I sign my name twice in a row, it doesn't look the same. You would think my scribble swoop is not that hard. So what are some of the things we're looking for there? And so is this what the NAACP is working on? You said we have some partners.
Yeah, no, I mean, I just want to be super transparent with all of your viewers. And, this is one of those times to really be checking in with Jews of color, frankly, because, like when well-meaning white Jews start calling African-American people and saying, oh, you should really vote. There's an extent to which it's really patronizing and probably not effective. There was a great blog post, by the way, about a week ago by Chris Harrison of the URJ, who wrote about the effects of COVID on not just the Black community, but on Jews of color. And we lifted up the voices of people like Deetra Reiser, Yolanda Savage-Narva, very prominent Jewish women of color in our movement that talked about what it's like. The truth is people only vote when they think their vote counts. And you can't convince someone that their vote counts. They actually have to experience the reality of that. So, one of the tactics, mostly it's going to have to come from the community itself. There's no question about it. But as allies, first of all, we don't have 100% voting in the Jewish community. So it's important that in the multiracial Jewish community, we're making sure that our own people are voting, people with whom we have a relationship. But one of the tools that we're starting to develop now is a way to get in relationship with potential voters now, not a week before when it's like, hi, you don't know me. And some of the good canvassing work comes when you had 3, 4, 5 conversations, the 5th of which is, okay, will you commit to vote? And all the 4 conversations that led up to it was why voting matters and really listening to people and hearing what they're struggling with and then being able to give them power by saying, do you know that thing you care about actually is going to be impacted in this election the following way? So I think it's much harder and more complicated than I can just do in 5 minutes, but that's the work. I mean, that's some number of people will just turn out by calling and reminding them to vote and getting them to commit. But some of that work is really helping people feel power through voting, which if they don't think their vote counts, then they don't feel power. By the way, that accounts for why young people don't vote.
Right.
Right. I mean, young people feel like, well, my planet has been cooked by the previous generation. I've had to go to active shooter drills my whole life. Elected officials have only made it worse my whole life. Why the hell would I, and by the way, the system makes it really hard because I'm at school, but I can't, my college doesn't count. as my voting place. So I have to figure out how to get an absentee ballot from home. The rules in my home state are hard, right? That's why it's a combination of both feeling disempowered by policy and then the process as well as disempowering.
So I had a request on the chat to ask you to share about what some of the other state projects, like RAC Illinois, RAC California, RAC Ohio, what are some of the wins that they have had?
Awesome. So working backwards, most recently, California, which was in the middle of a major legislative push for the state legislature, they had to completely scrap their agenda and pivot because of COVID. You couldn't go in and talk to state legislators about some of the things they were going to talk about, immigration and protecting immigrants and public education and finance. So they decided, rather than give up on their agenda, they utterly pivoted and said, what are the same values in the agenda we had and how can we apply them to COVID? They ran up a series of wins around getting homeless people into immediate housing, which is a public health issue, getting people early release from prison. Those are good examples, I think, of where, because RAC California has been around for almost a decade, they have a lot of power. The legislature knows them. There's a Jewish caucus in the state legislature that will actually call RAC California proactively and say, can you help us with this? So they're able to get further faster. But, I mean, I've seen victories even in Texas, which is a really hard and complicated state. They actually built a broad-based coalition, nonpartisan, around public education to make sure that the schools get more funding. Not the big kind of sexy win that you might get in a Florida or in a California, but really important bread and butter issue for people to make sure that schools are well funded. We're launching our New Jersey project this year, which I'm really pleased about. They decided that launching in the midst of COVID meant that they should have a series of House meetings to talk about how their own members were experiencing COVID and try and just build local networks to make sure people were getting immediate support and defense, which I'm super proud of. We just had a big victory in New York State called the Green Light Campaign, where undocumented people now have the right to get driver's license, which became a very important nonpartisan issue because it's a public safety issue. If undocumented people can't get access to driver's licenses, then they're disincentivized to actually follow the rules of the road. And, it leads to real public health problems. So Illinois passed some really meaningful legislation to make sure that vulnerable communities would get access to public education, and that those vulnerable communities cut across from undocumented people to trans students. So the power of the state work, I cannot underestimate. And you all are going to be led not only by your amazing volunteer leadership team, like Mark Bookbinder, Rabbi Greengrass, some of your other folks on this call, but Kara Gould, who is an amazing RAC staffer for many, many years, has put her hand up and said, I want to support the RAC Florida team with the amazing Joy Friedman, who some of you know, she's the director of organizing for the RAC. She's been coming back and forth from Florida for 3 or 4 years, helping local leaders, both with the ballot initiative 2 years ago, but helping your local leadership team. So I'm super optimistic about what Florida is going to do in the next cycle.
Thank you. So I know that you have a hard stop in 5 minutes, but I want to give Brittany Adams, one of our leaders in the congregation. She heads up our Miami Jews, which is our 20s, 30s group, and they do social justice work together. I want to invite her to ask you a question.
Hi. My question for you is, so you shared your origin story, which I loved. It was very beautiful.
Thank you.
And I know from personal experience, when you get involved in social justice work, you grow a lot and you learn a lot about yourself. And so I'm just curious, like, what have you learned about yourself, or in what ways have you grown through your social justice work?
I love that question, Brittany. And I've learned so much and really evolved. So I could pick like 10, but I want to pick just one. When I started working on these issues in college, and even actually in high school, because I was so upset and agitated by what I was witnessing, I think I underestimated the extent to which I was a powerful, privileged white person that was trying to like do for others. And I kind of like had this illusion that I could be colorblind and just be like, no, I've spent 20 years becoming more and more aware of the extent that because I happen to be born into maleness and whiteness and affluence, that by nature I have a serious amount of privilege. And when I show up in a room with people who are impacted by the systems, whether it's racism or the bigotry against immigrants, whatever the systems of oppression are that I'm trying to combat, I try and step back and listen first to people who are actually impacted. Not to speak for on behalf of LGBT people or people with disabilities, but to be led and taught by impacted people, and then to ask the question, what would be the best way for me to leverage my own power and my own privilege to be able to help push this through? And at the end of the day, Brittany, it's all about the relationships, really listening to people who are impacted, and then bringing us all together in relationships so that we can hold each other accountable to what we commonly want to see change in our society. I hope that makes sense.
Definitely. Thank you.
I should mention also that Brittany works for Teach for America, and so she has also dedicated her career to, helping others and educating the next generation. And I wanted
quick pitch, Rabbi Greengrass. I just think it's really important. Everybody goes on the RAC website, rac.org/CEC, which stands for Civic Engagement Campaign. Single easiest way, everybody tonight, while you're watching this, rac.org/CEC, which stands for Civic Engagement Campaign. It's a quick and dirty sign up, but you'll get more info. You're going to hear from Beth for sure, and you should be part of the Florida effort, but you might as well just get on our list. That way you'll get emails and all that kind of good stuff.
Thank you so much. And I want to thank you so much for your time. It is always such a joy to get to hear from you and learn from you. You are so inspiring, and just, it's like you're a heart walking around. You feel the authenticity and the love, and just how you've definitely found your right spot in the world. So thank you for being with us and for being our first Zoom social justice speaker.
Love it. Love it. All right. I have good people that I can suggest for your next one.
Oh, please send them to me.
Love you, Rabbi Greengrass. Love you, Beth. Also, I'm seeing my colleague, Rabbi Melissa Stolman, who works with me at the URJ. So thank you, Rabbi Stolman, for being here. And thank you for the great people at Beth. You guys rock.
Thank you. All right. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. We're going to go ahead and stop the live stream. And for those who want to stay on the call and